When Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, anti-Russian sentiment in the US, particularly in the mainstream media, skyrocketed to new levels. But this negative view of Russia has actually been growing steadily for over a decade, long before the invasion took place. Fighting words between Russia and the West have now escalated to fighting moves, and there are growing fears of even further escalation. In this climate of hatred and mistrust, negotiations have collapsed, and communications between US and Russian diplomats have been severed entirely. In this video, we're going to discuss this view of Russia as a threat and how this perception may not only lead to reality, but may also heavily influence it. Let's start by examining Europe's history. The European continent is made up of fiercely and competitive and paranoid nation-states that have a long history of conflict with one another. Oversimplified statement, I know. Now is as good a time as any to clarify that I'm just a YouTuber pleb living in Florida. I'm not an academic, and this channel does not represent an elite institution of higher learning. So bear in mind, this is just my opinion. All right. Again, the European continent is made up of fiercely competitive and paranoid nation-states that have a long history of conflict with one another. The British and French may have been close allies during World Wars I and II and may now be partners in the NATO alliance, but they have actually fought 41 wars against one another, including the infamous 100 Years' War. And that's just Britain and France. Since the 11th century, there have been over 900 wars between European states. The long history and experience with warfare and conflict has led to advanced diplomacy and battle tactics. In many cases, wars were fought preemptively out of the paranoia or fear that a war would come later and would be harder to win. So as hyper-vigilant nations embroiled in constant warfare, it doesn't come as a surprise that they would fight wars today with the belief that it would somehow prevent a greater or more destructive war tomorrow. When you are hyper-competitive, vigilant, and paranoid, and experienced with all the rules, you fight wars preemptively over the little details that you believe will secure your interests or preserve your state altogether. This is highlighted by virtually all combatants in World War II. Hitler and Stalin were paranoid of each other's intent and potential. Hitler feared Russia's potential to tip the scales of the war against France and Britain and undermine Nazi gains in the West. But Hitler also needed vast amounts of Russian oil for his war machine. Stalin knew that it was only a matter of time before Hitler came after him. At least that's what he believed. And his army wasn't ready, so he needed to buy time. What happens next is ridiculous. Both parties, paranoid of each other, decided to work together to invade Poland. They split the country in half and created a buffer zone between one another. Instead of fighting each other, they decided to try and help one another. Temporarily, of course. But this didn't quell Hitler's fears, nor did it solve his energy problem. He needed oil, and he knew Russia was modernizing its army. A war in the East was inevitable, at least from Hitler's perspective. So if they didn't fight Russia now, they would have to fight them later, and it would be impossible to stop an oil-fueled Russian juggernaut. So Hitler preemptively invaded Russia. Now think about Britain and France. In the mid-1930s, they both viewed Hitler as rising too quickly for their comfort. If Hitler wasn't stopped now, he would become too powerful for them to stop later. As a result, the saber rattling and tough talk went on for years and years. Yes, Germany was building an army and annexing territories and exercising an independent and aggressive policy. But this was all taking place in the East. None of it had yet to be aimed at either France or Britain. Still, both countries felt that it would eventually be their turn to face Germany. So in 1939, when Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland together, Britain and France decided to declare war on Germany. And of course, in the Eastern theater, Japan, nervous about US expansion into the Pacific and worried about a lack of energy resources, preemptively struck Pearl Harbor, hoping to cripple the US Navy and buy themselves time. This of course triggered US involvement in World War II. All of these wars, all of this violence, declared over fears, both real and imagined, of future potential conflict. There wasn't necessarily a guarantee that any major conflict was going to happen, yet all of these nations acted in ways that brought this conflict to life. And as a result, World War II came to fruition, and nearly 80 million people died. Now let's pause for a second. What do we have here? Hyper-vigilant, competitive states with a long history of warfare, the need for crucial energy resources, and no faith or trust in diplomacy or negotiations with one another. Remember these points. Now let's take a look at Russia. What stands out to you? Obviously, it's a very large country. In fact, it is the largest on Earth, covering 11% of Earth's landmass and covers half of the European continent. Now pay attention to its European neighbors, the hyper-competitive, militaristic nation-states. Where are they? They are all sandwiched together in the West. This is a major convenience for Russia. With less competitive, less aggressive neighbors to its north, south, and east, Russia has the luxury of a mostly undisturbed border. Simply being positioned next door to other competitive nations can be limiting, as it forces you to invest heavily in border security and defense, especially if you lack hills or mountains that protect you from the quick movement of troops. Consider Poland, for example. Sandwiched between Germany and Russia prior to World War II. There couldn't be a worse position to be in during that time. Of course, Russia has China to potentially worry about on their southeastern border, but current diplomatic relations can and have eased those concerns. So Russia has the benefit of not being sandwiched between or flanked by aggressive and competitive European states. Russia also has a large population and loads of natural resources. Russia is one of, if not the most, resource-rich nations on the planet. They have practically everything from food to water, to energy, to raw minerals and lumber. This is part of the reason why the sanctions haven't been as crippling as the West had hoped. Russia is self-sustainable due to its abundance of resources, and they have plenty to export all around the world to other developing nations such as India and China. The abundance of these resources, its geographic position, and the size of its population means that Russia has the greatest potential on the European continent to become the dominant power. So it doesn't matter to the West if they are the dominant power today. What matters to the West, and to the US specifically, is that Russia has the biggest bones to grow into. If left unchecked, Russia would continue to grow. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline deals meant that Russian oil and gas would fuel Western Europe's economies, and the economic collaboration with Germany was going to introduce not only new investment and wealth into Russia, but also technology and industrial innovation. The Russians were already bouncing back under Vladimir Putin after the Soviet Union's collapse, but a more robust economy would have meant an almost limitless potential for growth, and that growth would have led to more power. Now, would Russia use that power over their Western neighbors and invade or abuse them? Not necessarily. But when it comes to defense, you don't plan your fight over what you think your enemy would do. You have to plan your fight over what your enemy could do. And Russia could utilize its resources, industrial capacity, and population, not to mention their nuclear weapons, to exert its influence and dominate its neighbors. And that potential is enough to make them a target for concern, fear, and paranoia. So Russia may not view themselves as a threat, but it doesn't matter. Their mere existence as a unified state with an abundance of resources on the eastern flank of the continent makes them the greatest European threat of all. The West will never stop viewing Russia as a threat for this reason. They are hypervigilant, obsessed and experienced with warfare, and insecure over their lack of natural resources in Western Europe. So that is why Russia is a threat, and they are capable of becoming even more powerful. And so to the West, they're capable of becoming even more dangerous. The only way to ease Western paranoia over Russia is if Russia collapses entirely. This is actually the hope that many in the West have expressed with the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. They believe that Russia's invasion will lead to its own collapse, and that it will eventually split into a number of different states, which is what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. To understand what's at stake, we have to learn about this man, Halford Mackinder. He was a British geographer and politician, and is considered the forefather of geopolitics and geostrategy. His article, The Geopivot of History, is one of the most influential documents of the last 150 years and advances his Heartland theory. As a geographer and politician, Mackinder saw the world differently. In his mind, geography and politics converged into one. In his theory, he divides the world into 3 islands: the world island, the offshore islands, and the outlying islands. The largest landmass is clearly the world island. With most of the world's resources and population situated in this landmass, the world island is key to acquiring power on Earth. Within the world island is the heartland, and within the heartland is the flat terrain of the European plain, aka Eastern Europe. With the advancement of transport technology via railroads, Mackinder believed there was a growing opportunity for a major power to transport troops swiftly through the key areas of Eastern Europe and the heartland. This also meant that there was a growing opportunity to gain control over the world island as a whole, and therefore over the world as a whole. Mackinder's theory is famously summarized as follows: who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. who rules the world island commands the world. This theory became the bedrock of the Soviet Union and Russia's foreign policy for the last century. Situated perfectly in the heartland, Russia considered Mackinder's theory as their destiny. But Mackinder wasn't trying to inspire Russia's foreign policy. He was trying to warn Western Europe, specifically the British. Mackinder insisted that Britain's reliance on sea power would eventually become a weakness, as improved land transport would open up the heartland. Mackinder's theory was never fully proven, however, as no one power has ever controlled all three regions at the same time. Still, this theory has influenced both Russian and Western thinking for some time. It has therefore placed incredible significance on Eastern Europe. For Russia, however, it isn't just about power over the world, it's about securing its border effectively. Russia's size and geographical position is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it flanks Western Europe and is not sandwiched between aggressive, hyper-competitive European states. On the other, it does have a massive western border of flatlands that stretches for over 2,000 kilometers. And near its western border is the Russian core. This is where 80% of Russia's population lives. It is the most demographically dense region of Russia, and this is where the majority of its economic activity takes place. So while Russia has massive borders to protect, its most important region to worry about is the western border. This places even greater significance on control over Eastern Europe. Russia has to invest a significant amount of GDP on border defense. And with advancement in military technology, Russia has a never-ending commitment to innovating and advancing its military strength. As NATO expands into Eastern Europe through nations like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and potentially Ukraine, Russia has to expand military bases and defense capabilities to contend with advanced artillery, rocket systems, nuclear weapons, fighter jets and bombers, drones, tanks, and land troop invasions. So now you can understand why Ukraine is so important to both Russia and the West. For Russia, there is a geopolitical need to secure its most important border. And for the West, there is the threat of giving Russia control over the heartland and potentially the world island. Plus, Russia has an abundance of very important resources. So there is a heightened sense of paranoia centered around an unproven theory and mistrust of one another's intentions. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia transitioned into the Russian Federation, there was a fear that NATO would expand into Eastern Europe and threaten Russia's existence as a nation. But the US verbally promised Russia that it would not expand NATO. So for a time, it seemed that Russia would let go of this world island theory and worry not about aggressive Western neighbors on its most vulnerable border. But this was a false promise and a false sense of security, however, as NATO did expand several times into Eastern Europe. This expansion militarized the neighbors on Russia's western border, and it isn't clear why NATO and the West insisted upon this expansion. Was it to prevent Russia's rise and resurrection from ever taking place? Was it to secure US dominance over Europe for good? Was it to apply economic pressure on Russia to force them to keep pace militarily with NATO, with the hope of this causing a collapse? Regardless of the West's true intentions, the Russian perspective is that they are seen as a threat, even during times of weakness. If NATO and the West did not see Russia as a threat, then they would not have expanded NATO. Now, we have arrived at the point of this video, the self-fulfilling prophecy of the Russian threat. The Pygmalion effect is a psychological phenomenon. Basically, a person's belief or expectation of another person can influence their behavior towards that person in such a way that the person's actions align with those beliefs or expectations. If someone consistently treats another person as a bad or evil individual, it can have the profound impact on the person's self-perception and behavior. They may internalize negative labels and start to act in a way that aligns with the negative expectations placed upon them, thus reinforcing the cycle where the person's behavior confirms the original perception, further solidifying the belief in their evil nature. This concept can be applied to nation states. An international international relations, perceptions and expectations between nations can shape their behavior and interactions. If one nation consistently portrays another as a hostile or dangerous entity, it can contribute to a cycle of distrust, antagonism, and conflict. The labeled nation may respond defensively or even aggressively, reinforcing the negative perception held by the other party. This dynamic can see tensions escalate due to mutual mistrust, miscommunication, or historical grievances. The actions of one nation, driven by their perception of the other as a threat, can inadvertently lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy where both parties become increasingly entrenched in adversarial positions. There is no better example of this than on the European continent. With centuries of conflicts between one another, mistrust, miscommunication, and historical grievances are plentiful. There is so much at play in the current relations between Russia and the West. There is the belief that Russia's border security is at stake. There is the belief that the fate of the entire world is at stake. The belief that one nation is an untrustworthy, inherent threat. There is the belief in good versus evil, the need for energy and natural resources to fuel economies and drive wealth, and a long list of historical grievances that are far too many to count. And Ukraine has unfortunately become the epicenter of manifestation for all of these issues to converge upon. NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe was preemptive. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was preemptive. The escalation as a whole by everyone is preemptive. And while some of these issues are real, much of it is imagined and therefore unnecessary. One of the greatest criticisms of Mackinder's theory is that it assumes a conflict in a system where there doesn't need to be one. So it's terrifying and tragic that as we inch closer towards nuclear Armageddon between hyper-vigilant and competitive nation states, we may be vanquishing ourselves over imagined fears. Instead of prioritizing diplomacy, negotiations, trustworthiness, and the distribution of resources for all the world's needs, we are saber-rattling and warmongering. The Russian threat is real, but it's also imagined. The question is whether or not the world will prioritize diplomacy and de-escalation or the saber-rattling, tough talk, lies, deceit, and war that we've been seeing. We've already witnessed the horrors of World Wars I and II. If the Pygmalion effect is true and our growing mistrust of one another continues, we may sleepwalk ourselves into a conflict that could vaporize all of us in a fiery ball of destruction. Dramatic, I know. Decide for yourself. This is just my opinion. Thanks for watching. Please comment and subscribe, as this sort of content is often shadow banned by the algorithm. We just hit 1,000 subscribers, so a big thank you to everyone who has been supporting this channel thus far. We have big plans, so stay tuned. Please do comment. As I mentioned before, I'm not an academic, and so there's probably a lot of holes in my argument that maybe can be plugged with contributions by you. So let me know what you think in the comments section. Please contribute to the discussions and discourse. Be friendly and respectful to one another. Let's benefit from each other in the comment section. Take care.
Trust nothing. No law.